Ok, hola a todos y todas, bienvenido al segundo seminario web de nuestra serie de seminarios por otoño. Hoy día tenemos doctora Heather McKillop con nosotros, quien presentará todo sobre sus investigaciones en Belize. Antes de comenzar, mientras nos reunimos en una plataforma virtual, nos gustaría conocer la importancia de la tierra de cada uno, llama hogar. De costa a costa reconocemos humildemente el territorio ancestral y eternal de Inuit, Métis y personas de las primeras naciones que llaman hogar a esta tierra. También lo informamos que nosotros próximo y último seminario por otoño presentará el doctor Leonardo López Luján, quien hablará de los descubrimientos arqueológicos debajo del centro de Ciudad de México. Tendrá lugar de viernes 19 de noviembre a las 6 horas central. Márquelo en sus calendarios. So hello everyone, welcome to the second webinar of our fall webinar series. Today we have Dr. Heather McKillop with us, who will be presenting about her research in Belize. Before we get started, while we meet in a virtual platform, we would like to acknowledge the importance of the land which we call home. From coast to coast, we respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nation peoples that call this land home. We would also like to let you know that our next and final webinar for the fall will feature Dr. Leonardo López Luján, who will talk about his recent excavations in the center of Mexico City. It will take place on Friday, November 19th at 6 p.m. Central Time. Ahora lo pasaré a Matt, quien presentará a la oradora invitada de hoy, Dr. McKillop. So now I would like to pass it on to Matt, who will introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. McKillop.
Hello, everybody. Happy to see some people here today and everybody meeting with us virtually on Facebook as well. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Heather McKillop, who is a Canadian-American archaeologist whose research has examined ancient Maya coastal trade routes, seafaring, and the production and long-distance exchange of commodities, in particular salt. She is the Thomas and Lillian Landrum Alumni Professor in the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She received her Bachelor of Science and Master of Arts degrees at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario, and her PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Since 2004, Heather and her team have been focused on the discovery, mapping, excavation, sediment coring, and analysis of waterlogged remains and wooden architecture preserved below the seafloor at coastal sites in southern Belize. She is also the director of the Digital Imaging and Visualization in Archaeology lab at LSU, which produces 3D replicas of artifacts from the Underwater Maya project. She is the author of several books, including The Ancient Maya, New Perspectives, In Search of Maya Sea Traders, Salt, White Gold of the Ancient Maya, and Maya Salt Works. She has authored or co-authored numerous journal articles, her most recent in the upcoming issue, but available now, and I believe it's open access, of Ancient Mesoamerica with Dr. Cory Sills. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Heather McKillop and look forward to her talk.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk at class and and share this information with you. I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, so my I assume everyone can see this. You'll let me know if you can't. My talk is titled "What's New Below the Seafloor at Ek Way Nal, Belize." Ek Way Nal is an underwater site in Punticacas Lagoon, a large saltwater lagoon system in southern Belize. Here's a map of Belize. It's in the far south, and it's a very remote area. Today it's unoccupied, but the ancient Maya from the Middle Preclassic through the Post-Classic were on the coast. And I've had the privilege of working with some Maya from Lubantun, bringing them out, or from the nearby site of Lubantun, bringing them out to work on the keys here with us. Today, I'm going to talk about work that we've done over the years at Ek Way Nal. we had Cory Sills and I had planned in 2020 to do our second field season of a big project excavating Ek Way Nal. And then we planned again earlier this year, but because of everyone's similar experiences, not being able to travel or do research, we're hoping in 2020 to be able to do some major excavations. So in the meantime, I have worked on material that we exported under permit and analyzed data that I had. And so I'm going to give you an overview of things that I've done recently and also the earlier field work leading up to our Ancient Mesoamerica article, which just came out in first view, and in preparation, hopefully, for our 2020 excavations. If you want to see some nice pictures and you don't want to listen to me talk, you can look at our website, underwatermaya.com. We've got movies and 3D images and so forth there. So here's the article, soon to be open access. I haven't been able to get it open access here. I got a copy from the publisher, but it will be open access, and hopefully people will be able to get it. And if you can't, let me know. So I've been interested in salt for a long time. And ever since we've found the first salt working sites in Punticacas Lagoon and realized what they were, I used to say on this map, I blotted it out today. It says, where did the classic Maya get their salt? We know where they got it. It's more interested now in how did they classic Maya get salt? Because in particular, the classic Maya at the lowland cities in the central area here during the classic period didn't have enough salt. They needed to get salt, and there's lots of salt making sites on the coast. Tony Andrews, many years ago in the 1980s, suggested there was long distance trade of salt from the vast salt flats off the north coast of the Yucatan. And here you see it's through solar evaporation. Well, since then, a lot of salt working sites have been found along and off the coast of Belize, but they were, for the most part, underwater and difficult to identify. And it was a different technique, so it's not as visible, but it leaves durable remains in terms of pottery. This is brine boiling brine in pots over fires and evaporating it slowly by fire. And this is a very common technique around the world, historically and prehistorically, and even today. And it produces briquetage, the term used for the broken pots and the vessel supports, as you see here. So I'm going to talk about the Paynes Creek Salt Works in general, and then about Ek Way Nal specifically, and then come back to how did the classic Maya get their salt, and give you some ideas. So I published a book, Salt, White Gold of the Ancient Maya, and it was based on excavations of 3 underwater sites where they were boiling brine in pots over fires to make salt. But it was clearly 3 sites were not going to make much of an impact to supply the salt needs, the dietary salt needs of the Maya at inland sites during the classic period. And so I had conversations with Tony Andrews and others about, well, okay, I need to go and find if there are more salt making sites. This is an artist's illustration from French journal Sciences et Avenir. And I think the process of boiling the brine, you see the pot legs here and the jars. This is a really accurate idea of what was going on. The clothing may be a little off, but I think you get the idea. And again, briquetage is the term that people use around the world for the broken pieces of the salt making artifacts, the jars, the bowls, the pot legs, everything involved in the evaporation over fire. And it's the French word, obviously. So in 2004, I had a sabbatical, and I got a faculty research grant from LSU to be able to hire someone with a fast boat. And that was my boat driver, Jackie Young, who was more than a boat driver, also jumped in the water and is part of the team. And one of the things about the underwater sites is some of the pottery is really big because there's nobody walking, no animals. Well, there are jaguars walking. Sometimes we follow jaguar paw prints in the water, but for the most part, the sites are undisturbed. And so we find big pieces. And we were essentially doing pedestrian survey, usually in better formation here, but we hadn't really started. And I'm usually the one to take the photographs. So I'm taking photographs and then joining everybody in the water. And so we found 14 sites, lots of briquetage, and I was measuring them to try to quantify things and look for standardization and so forth. And then we found wood at site 15. And as you know, wood decays in the tropical landscape of the Maya area. And so it was unexpected. And we were walking in a mangrove swamp. I kind of made it sound a little more glamorous by saying a saltwater coastal lagoon, but it's a mangrove swamp all the way around. And there were mangroves growing in the water. And so when my boat driver would say, "Hey man, there's a post," I said, "Jackie, it's just a stick. It's just, we're in a swamp." But finally we did excavate one. We were ill-equipped for excavating, but we dug around without pulling it up and raised it standing in waist deep water, and it was sharpened at the end. This was the first one that we found, and you can see sharpened at the end. On a good day with clear water, this is what you might see, but they're really hard to find. And they were all over the underwater sites that I published in my salt book, but we didn't find any. And so there's a lot of issues there. Like, we didn't find them because we weren't looking for them. They're not supposed to be there, but they are really difficult to find. And usually you don't actually see the post, you feel it with your hands, and our fingers get all scraped up. So then we started seeing wood everywhere. And you can see it's incredibly well preserved because it's in mangrove peat, which is produced by, is deposited by the red mangroves as they grow taller to keep their leaves above the water as sea level rises or the land subsides, or both. And so they're along the coast of Belize, offshore, in southern Belize, there's as much as 11 meters of mangrove peat. So that's evidence of rising seas during the Holocene and the creation of the Belize Barrier Reef System for tourism. And in the lagoon system, we have several meters of mangrove peat. And so the upper part, the sea floor, is mangrove peat. So anything that's preserved in the peat is preserved. Anything that's out of the peat is all worm-eaten. So the posts were preserved where they were stuck in the ground, driven into the ground to sharpen ends when the buildings were constructed. And we've done quite a bit of work on the marine sediment. I have a doctoral student continuing to do that. So I realized that rather than walking on the seafloor and damaging the sites and not being able to see them, we needed to figure out a different strategy. So I had a new field project, and because of the wood, I was able to get grants. A new field project mapping ancient Maya wooden buildings below the seafloor of Belize. And so we used these research flotation devices, and much like pedestrian survey, except we floated systematically back and forth, pivoting at the end of a row, marking it with a long PVC pipe, and searching the seafloor, looking and feeling, as you see here. And we started out using masks and snorkels, and some of us just ditched that, and we all use polarized dark glasses. And we'd find posts and flag them, and we'd find artifacts and flag them. And it really didn't make much sense until it was mapped. But there was no spacing between surveyors, and it's a very successful technique of finding things. We found and individually mapped using a total station over several years, 4,042 posts at 70 sites. We have 110 sites total, but some of the sites were too remote or the water was too deep for the total station to map them. We found two categories of posts: hardwood posts, like you see here, and you can still see it's got bark on it, and palmetto palm posts, as you see. I know whose hand that is. That's Amanda Evans, former doctoral student, now Dr. Evans. And you can see the bark there. These are used along the shoreline today in Belize, and I know elsewhere, to shore up the shoreline, and they're really water resistant. And they were used at the edge of many of our sites to probably to shore up the coastline, and also I think to mark boundaries of sites, because we find artifacts inside but not outside. And they're very durable shells, very difficult to find. And we sampled a lot of them using knives, and we also excavated using knives. I've got all the details in Maya Salt Works. So this is part of one of our GIS maps, and it shows you nice rectangular structure. There's a scale. This is site 74. There's two buildings. There's the line of palmetto palms, and we actually excavated this site. There's some other rectangular buildings. Some places the mangrove has grown up since the sites were occupied. There's been accretion, and so it's covering them. In other places, there's erosion. So it's really a complex pattern. But overall, we have a lot of sites, and some of them looks like there was construction of the same spot over time. So here's Ek Way Nal, underwater site. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, of the sites. So Cory and I have a project. We've only had our first field season, but we wanted to look at the organization of production of salt and how it placed in the Maya economy. And we had on previous work, my previous projects had found salt kitchens where they were evaporating the brine in pots over fires, but where did the people live and how was it organized? What other activities were going on? So we thought the big sites might hold a clue, the ones that had multiple buildings. So we know Ek Way Nal from the previous work and from the map, which I'll show you, had 10 buildings. The other site that we were able to excavate in, I'm not sure why we started with this one in 2019, but it's much shallower and easier perhaps, is Tabnukna in another branch of the lagoon. It also has at least 10 wooden structures. And I get the names from the FAMSI website, and I have their supposed to be ancient Maya names, and there's a Maya speaker who says the words. So Ek Way Nal means fiery water place. And the site, we don't know how far it extends, but it goes from about 6 inches near the shoreline to at least 6 feet. And it continues on the other side of these mangroves. It probably is under the mangroves as well. So what we're doing, I should go back to this. You can see the flotation survey. There's just 3 people here now, but I was going to join them shortly afterwards after taking more photos. And we have large inflatables for holding all our gear when we're in the water and going back and forth. And then here you see a close-up of a bunch of the team following a line of palmetto palm posts and feeling them. There's John Young, our boat driver, Amanda Evans, Cory Sills, Mark Robinson, Breton Summers. Some of you know these people. They're all PhD geography students now, former. They've earned their degrees and all working in archaeology. We have a 4,000-year record of sea level rise from radiocarbon dated peat deposits in the lagoon. And so you can see it's really hard to stay away from, to get enough distance. And I know underwater archaeologists in Europe in particular have found that shallow underwater sites are really difficult to approach because you don't want to damage the site. So you have, how do you get the distance? So So we have our RFDs. And we found artifacts. So here's briquetage. Here's Dr. Sills holding 2 pieces of a jar. And there's Mark and Cory with a part of a water jar that has some decoration on it. And what we might see if the water is clear and there's no silt, artifacts on the seafloor. And then we set up a total station and map. So I put these in because it's a little different than your typical mapping project. So we had to set up, I learned from experience that the total station is not like a transit. You have to set up a total station on firm ground or else you get an error message. And so we would find some firm ground, even if it was underwater, and pour concrete data markers. And then someone goes with the prism pole and puts the end of the prism on top of a post or an artifact. And here's John Young helping Breton to locate specifically where it is. And then, of course, recording it from the total station. In places where the water was deeper, like here, we used fish floats from your fishing store attached to fishing line and skewered in the ground in the seafloor with pieces of metal to mark where the artifacts were. And then we attached some flagging tape with a number or a letter so we could match things up on the total station. And there's one of our PVC pipes marking where we use to mark the end of rows before we pivot on survey. That was Zoe Morris, another Canadian who went to LSU. She's now, I think, at UBC. She earned her PhD. No, she earned her master's at LSU and her PhD at Western, and did isotopes at Western. And there am I. We're all wearing our dark glasses. So here's the map that I produced from our GIS and called them buildings A through J, so 10 buildings. And this is a map that's in the Ancient Mesoamerica article. So these are all hardwood posts, and here's a line of palmettos. We're not really sure what's going on here. Hopefully we plan to excavate each of these buildings hopefully in the spring of 2020. So we'll see. So what was going on here? I think contrary to that first picture that I showed you, kind of a beach party outside making some salt and then going back to your house, there was an infrastructure of production. They were making salt in salt kitchens, indoors, like this photo from the Robert C. West photo collection at the LSU Map Library, courtesy of our map librarian, John Anderson. And the model that I've been using is, and Cory and I continue to use, is Sacapulas, Guatemala, in the highlands of Guatemala, where there's a salt spring. And the people in Sacapulas, until fairly recently, produced salt. They had salt kitchens that were dedicated buildings where everything was related to making the salt. And the houses were farther back. Each family had a salt kitchen. The only thing that wasn't done in the salt kitchen was making these brine boiling bowls. Making these brine boiling bowls that you see here. They made them outside the houses. They weren't fired. They were simply pressed clay over molds and then dried in the sun. And so they'd have a couple of dozen of these bowls held up over a fire in the center of the salt kitchen. And someone using a calabash bowl would pour brine continuously in here. And you can see there's lots of other gear associated with this. This is a wonderful ethnographic, almost ethno-archaeological study that's published in Expedition by Ryan and Monaghan. And then this is some of our briquetage that we find. So there's a lot more substance to the production. Before they were boiling the brine in the salt kitchen, they would carry salty soil from the salt spring and put it in a container, a wooden box, and then take salty water and pour it over to increase the salinity and collect it underneath. And we've actually, at the Eleanor Betty site at the Paynes Creek Salt Works, we found a repurposed canoe with a large clay funnel underneath it. And the canoe was kind of held up with some wooden pegs, and it was at the edge of the site. And so I interpret that as a brine enrichment facility. And we have one big site that's been excavated in the mangroves, not underwater, that is two huge piles of soil, which my former student, Dr. Rachel Watson, excavated and interpreted as basically a slag heap that was used, that was probably more common, but they were washed away at the underwater sites. So they would then take the enriched brine into the salt kitchen and store the brine. They also took some salty soil and stored it. So this was a dry season activity, but even in the rainy season, they could process salt, make salt, and trade it whenever they wanted. Of course, the salt kitchens that we have in the lagoon are pole and thatch. They're not made of stone, as you see here. And so here's again, we have bowls and jars that are smooth on the inside and rough on the outside, and they're held up by solid clay cylinders. The longest one, I think, is about 36 centimeters. Usually they're broken, and they have globs of clay on the top with a concave surface, and on the bottom, a glob of clay, and it's flattened. And it wasn't just one like this, but we have found the cylinders on an angle, and it's likely that there were 3 of them holding up a pot, like tripod vessels that the Maya had. So you can see here from the pink stars on this map that the briquetage was found at some buildings, but not everywhere. So not in these places, but in great abundance over here and over here. Now, this is collecting things from the sea floor, and we didn't collect everything. So it's certainly a biased sample. The reason that we collected things and individually flagged them and then individually mapped them with the total station was to get an idea of the time period, and also to collect some diagnostic briquetage. So we hope to find more quantitative, we will find more quantitative data from our excavations when we're able to go back. But at, for example, site 74 that I showed you before on that big map, we found, and other sites where we excavated salt kitchens, 90 to 98% of the artifacts were briquetage. So it's overwhelmingly salt making activities. We don't see that here. We see other things were picked up as well. For example, storage jars. This is all discolored. This is, call it Wari red, but it's like a Tinaja red, or there's other names. It's a very common style of late intermediate classic storage jar, and would have been painted red. We find traces of red slip. The interesting thing in southern Belize and into Guatemala, places like Cebal, Altar, and in the Maya Mountains, at cave sites, there's stamp decorations. And so we have little monkeys stamped onto it here. We have backwards S's, and they were stamped around. So it's called unit stamped, and it's very distinctive. And there's a lot of varieties of stamp decorations here, which, along with petrographic analysis that Dr. Linda Howie's doing it in London, Ontario, will help us refine the trade relations between the coast and the interior, and help address who are the consumers of this salt. In addition to making salt, I was surprised when I collaborated with Kazuo Aoyama, who some of you may know is the leading expert on useware for the Maya area on stone tools, particularly chert and obsidian, but also now ground stones. And he analyzed some of the chert artifacts from the lagoon sites, including half a dozen from Ek Way Nal, as it turned out. And he found that most of them were used for cutting fish or meat, or scraping, like scaling fish, and very few of them were used for cutting wood. I anticipated that with 4,042 wooden posts that we had individually mapped, that was a lot of cutting that they needed to do, and chert tools would have done that. Some of the interesting things, you can see this is open access article on PNAS 2018. The unifacial stem points, the points, and in fact on these other tools, the points were not used. There's no useware according to Dr. Aoyama. It's the sides. They were used as knives and not as points. And the other thing is to me really interesting is that most of them had multi-use. They were used for multiple uses. So you might find, and you can see this on the article, that there are the different places on the tool edges that had different uses for cutting and scraping. Some of them hide, some of them, or fish scales, and some of them for cutting, and a minority for woodworking. So what happened to the fish? I haven't mentioned any fish. The mangrove peat, although it preserves the wood in perfect condition, except that it's waterlogged, which is kind of a conservation issue. Nightmare, I could say, but we have to keep everything wet if we take anything out. The mangrove peat is acidic, and it does not preserve anything with calcium carbonate. So bone is not preserved. We have no fish bones, no other animal bones, including no human bones, no bones. It also eats away at the dolomite and crushed limestone temper in pottery. The briquetage is not tempered with that, but we do have water jars that have that temper, and you just have voids. It's all eaten away. We also excavated some deep underwater shell mounds, hoping to find intact shell to do oxygen isotope, and the results came back, there's nothing there. So it's completely eaten away, which was a little disappointing, but we do have the wood. So I can explain, it's a good thing that we looked at the stone tools, because otherwise we would have no idea that they were probably making salt and also salting fish. A minority of the chert tools were used for cutting or whittling wood. So there's like 2 artifacts. And some of them were used for cutting fish and cutting or whittling wood. And you'll notice here's the unifacial stem point that was used. It's a different one, but same style. You can't say unifacial stem points were used for cutting fish or scraping fish. Well, they were also multi-purpose. And it could be that chert was a scarce resource, and so they hoarded it and used it for multiple purposes. But they did rework some of these things, but they're in pretty good shape. So they seem to have some good access to trade goods. So as I said, it's open access. You can just look on the PNAS website and download this. And I also have to mention, I had the great pleasure, and it was really exciting, my 12 minutes of fame being interviewed on Science Friday with the famous Ira Flato. You don't know probably who that is in Canada, but he's a really great science interviewer on PBS radio. So they recorded it and put it on their website. So we also found, this is all before, we haven't done any excavating, Building J, right beside post 255, a jadeite gouge with a rosewood handle. Now, the Maya, there's several things about this. One is that it's really beautiful green translucent jadeite, which is unexpected at a salt work. And the other thing is we have an attached wooden handle, which is a rare find in the Maya area, particularly for jadeite. And it doesn't appear to be in a burial location. It was right beside a post. So the way that it was discovered, my boat driver, Jackie, and I were sampling posts with 18-inch stainless steel kitchen knives. You need to know where you set down your knife and where your partner's knife is. And he reached out to me with his hand and sort of, look at this. And he opened it up and there was a jadeite gouge. And I'm like, whoa, Jackie, feel around that post a bit more and see what else you can find. And he came up with we were clearing to get clean wood to cut post samples. We weren't digging to find things, but he came up with the rosewood handle and put them together, and it's a perfect fit. So we took photos and movies the moment after discovery, and then they went in water in plastic bags and kept everything wet until we could get an export permit. This has been professionally conserved. I was able to take this out of the country to hand carry only. And George Harlow, I went to the American Museum of Natural History, where he's a geologist. He's probably the world's expert on jadeite. And he determined, it's in the article, that the reason that this seems unexpected, it's 98% pure jadeite. And the translucent green color, the translucent appearance, is a symptom of the tightly woven grades in the jadeite that make it a particularly durable material for a tool. Unfortunately, April Sievert, who I hand carried, gave it to her next, wasn't able to determine the specific use. She found evidence for hafting down here, but she couldn't, at the bit end, she didn't find it. But she's going to take another look now that we know that there was fishing going on and processing fish and not just salt. So needless to say, I really want to be the one to excavate this building next spring. And I'll get Jackie to do the screening of the deposits, maybe, if I'm lucky. So I had some archaeological correlates of activities in different spaces, trying to think of how to interpret the building. And this chart in a different form is in our Ancient Mesoamerica article, table 3. So I was looking at, what would we expect in a household versus a salt kitchen versus a place for fish processing versus brine enrichment, which may all have occurred at this site, Ek Way Nal. And in addition, there may have been other activities that were supporting the salt making and the salting of fish and so forth. But a household, we expected to have a diversity of pottery, in contrast to a salt kitchen where it would be focused on briquetage. Fish processing, we really didn't expect pottery. And brine enrichment, we'd expect some storage jars. I should also have put funnels for it. Household, for stone tools, a diversity of household tools, like most of us have excavated at households. In the salt kitchen, we could find corn grinding, because at Sacapulas, they put cornmeal inside the pots before they add the brine to boil them. It seals it. And they also use pieces of corn, meal, to put in the brine to test the salinity. And when it floats, it's salty enough, according to them. So corn grinding could be something associated with salt kitchen as well as a household. Fish processing, well, we'd expect some stone tools because we have that evidence. Brine enrichment, we don't expect stone tools, but we expect some kind of, for example, a box for salting fish, or some kind of a rack for drying the fish, something like that. Food remains we'd expect, although apparently not animal bones or fish bones in the household or burials in the household. But we do find lots of plant food remains like kahun, koyol, memi, apple, and others. Salt kitchens, we don't expect them to be eating in there. It's not a chip stand like you'd find on the side of the road in Ontario. Fish processing, fish and animal remains, well, not at these sites. A fish rack or some kind of box for salting fish, different processes for processing the fish. Ritual items we might expect at households. And I didn't mention, we do find a lot of ocarinas, the figurine whistles, which again are stylistically similar to, some of them at least, to items from the site of Luban-Tun. And household, we'd expect activities indoors and outdoors. Salt kitchen indoor, at Sacapulas, they dump the broken pots after they've used them. Just they keep them for a while inside, and then they eventually dump them just outside. Fish processing, I think we'd expect that to be outside. And brine enrichment certainly is something that's outside. So we came into those thinking that. There's a lot more detail in the Ancient Mesoamerica article that Cory and I developed later, but came up with some ideas just based on what we had here for this talk, that down here is where we found, this is the line of Palmetto Pompos, where we found chert tools that were used for processing fish or meat, and we find briquetage. And the same here with building C. So that's building A and building C. Building B, E, and G have a lot of briquetage. These buildings don't, and there's building J is where the Jadeite gouge was. We don't really have much for these buildings. I think we weren't really biased when we were mapping the posts and mapping and deciding what artifacts to take, because we really couldn't tell where we were. There was no sign saying, here we are in building D, you need to pick up some artifacts now. So because we couldn't see anything really, we couldn't see any pattern until we put things onto a GIS. So, here's some GIS maps of where there's briquetage, where there's storage jars, processing fish, and so forth. So how does this fit then into a larger picture? Some of this, well, the details are in my Maya Salt Works, and there's some details in the article with Kazuo Aoyama on, what's going on? How did the Maya in the classic period, these big cities where they needed salt, how did they get dietary salt and maybe salted fish as well, but dietary salt principally? And I really think there's a regional trade of salt. So regionally from the North Coast, they were bringing salt into this area because we know it was occupied in the classic and pre-classic as well as the post-classic. And now that we know that there's sites along the coast of Belize, they were producing it along the coast and even out on Ambergris Key and trading it inland. And also in the highlands at Sacapulas and other places. And then there's a Salinas de los Nueve Cerros, where there's estimates of a lot of salt being made. The estimates that I came up with for the Paynes Creek sites were based on Sacapulas and the production levels that are detailed in the article by Ryan and Madigan. So depending on how many salt kitchens, here I just said how many sites were occupied. If we have 100 sites, if we only had 10, maybe there's 60 tons. If we had 100, 600 tons of salt produced. What we've found now is that we have, giving away a little bit of the secret from Cory and my current research, and some of this in the Ancient Mesoamerica article, that we can't just date a site, we need to radiocarbon date each building because they're multi-component sites. And so it's they're not built one on top of each other, they're sequentially used. And so I've got some of that chronological information we put into the Ancient Mesoamerica article. We had money from radiocarbon dates to date after our excavations, but we had wooden posts from Ek Way Nal in the archaeology lab at LSU. And I'm like, so I said, Cory, we should just go ahead and date them and we can excavate later. So this is really going to help us in planning the excavations. So there could be a lot more. And of course, from the North Coast, I got that from Tony Andrews, who had done research on in the archives and so forth. So I think, you know, these numbers are flexible, and depending now that with the LIDAR research that there may be actually a lot more Maya in the classic period than we previously thought, but there's more salt making sites as well. So I think it's not a long distance trade of salt, it's a regional trade. So how did the regional trade work? Well, at Sacapulas, they were making salt, then they were turning once it evaporated and it's solid, they were turning the pots over and hardening them by the fire. So they're solid salt cakes. And here you see a pile of salt cakes on the side of the in the salt kitchen, and broken vessels, which they would later then dump out. And so I found that, yeah, this is really common at other places, not just Sacapulas, but other places in the Maya highlands where salt making was done until recently, trading salt cakes of different sizes and shapes and so forth. So then I looked at our salt making pots that we have and thought, gee, you know, maybe they were trading blocks of salt, hardened salt cakes. So I've got some details in salt as a commodity or money in the classic Maya economy. And I think, so there's the details of regional trade. I like to think of places like the Seren site and Paynes Sheet's description of different families, households specializing in different products, and then exchanging with their the surplus household production with other households in the community, and also taking their commodities to regional markets and acquiring things that they didn't have, like obsidian, and bringing them back. And so there's a lot of access to things from near and far. And if we look at other places like Caracol, where it's a big site, but they have marketplaces at the ends of roadways of this enormous site, again, lots of trade of local materials. So I think that I like to think that the salt trade fits into this pattern of regional production. Most of the money that we know of from the classic period is related to elite trade and cacao and woven cotton. What we have from the contact period also underscores that. But there's a lot that changed over 600 years from the end of the classic period to the arrival of the Spaniards. And I think looking to other places, even central Mexico, and looking to the Aztecs, who had a vibrant trade in regional trade in various commodities, is a viable option. And that just as, well, I like to look at that, they're not as different as we once thought, the economies of central Mexico and the classic Maya. So what's new at Ek Way Nal? Well, there's a lot new, and there's more in the Ancient Mesoamerica article by Dr. Sills and me. And hopefully in 2022, hopefully in March, but maybe later, we'll be excavating inside the buildings using dive gear with an NSF grant. Stay tuned for fieldwork dates and updates on Underwater Maya. We also have a Facebook page, Underwater Maya Research Group, and also the DIVA Lab with our 3D images. I didn't show any 3D images. I can't believe it. Whoa, I thought I had acknowledgements. I don't know what happened to them. Let me just say, I'd like to acknowledge permits from the Institute of Archaeology, Government of Belize, and National Science Foundation and Louisiana State University for funding and support from the community of Punta Gorda, many friends, our host family at Village Farm, John Spang and Tanya Russ and their kids and their children, their adult children, and the field team, Breton Summers, Mark Robinson, Cory Sills, Amanda Evans, Zoe Morris, and others over the years. And thank you very much.
I don't know if we have some questions here.
I have a question, Heather. I'm curious if you think that the brine boiling and salt production was a seasonal activity or if it was something that was happening year round.
Yeah, I know that Tony Andrews still would like to think that that what we have are similar to open shelters that they have at the salt works on the north coast of the Yucatan, where people come, set up their hammocks for a while and are gathering the salt. But I really think that these are permanent, that people were living there year round or nearby year round in order to maintain their and guard their equipment, guard their buildings and maintain the buildings. And the reason that the buildings were more substantial, because even in the so-called dry season in the far south of Belize, it rains a lot. So the estimates that I made in the salt book are based on 4 months of dry season. But, and you would need to have shelter, like you need to have walls to protect the fire from the wind and from rain that comes. I mean, we were out in a tropical storm once in the lagoon in May in the dry season. And so this could happen all the time. But I like to think that just like at Sacapulas, it could, if you have salt making going on indoors, you can do it any time. And clearly at Sacapulas, they're thinking about that because they store jars of brine that's been enriched, and they also build up the floor. And I don't know, I mean, they pile salty soil inside the salt kitchen and raise the level of the floor significantly. It doesn't say in the article how much, but they are really interested in making salt whenever they want to make salt. And so I think it could have gone on year round, but certainly people were living there year round.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I appreciate that answer. Just a quick follow-up question. And I agree with you. I think they were doing it year round. Do you think they were trading for staples like maize and corn, or were they growing it somewhere nearby?
I think they were, I really think, I like to think of like surplus household production where they were, the family, maybe an extended family, someone in the family was taking things to markets. And we have a canoe, we have the canoe paddle, which I didn't show. We have broken other pieces of canoe paddles. And so they were I think they were taking salt cakes and salted fish. And the coast of Belize also, where we stay, is an organic chocolate farm. with 5,000 chocolate trees. And so, and we found only one, but it was limited excavation underneath one of our coral rock building platforms on Frenchman's Key, a cacao seed. And so from the Lake Classic. And so they had cacao there. If they were taking things along the coast and then up rivers to the interior, coming back, they would have needed ballast, even if they didn't want to bring something back. If you've ever been out in the open sea in a dugout canoe, I like to travel with a lot of weight in the boat. Even, think about ballast if you're sailing, or if you're in a boat of any kind, if you're a passenger, if you're a crew member, you're really just ballast to be moved around. So I think it would make sense for them. And I also think that they were salt makers. They were making salt, and that was their commodity. And they were bringing in a lot of other things, because we have a lot of non-local pottery. I didn't mention we have Belize red serving bowls in very small quantities, but we have them all over at many of the sites. We have lots of different, from what Linda Howie has found so far, lots of different kinds of stamped pottery from different paste recipes, suggesting different production locales that are not the quartz sand of the briquetage. And so it's not material that's locally available. There's dolomite and limestone, but not nearby. And then the figurine whistles, the jadeite, the chert. There's lots of things that were moving around. I think that I like to think of the coast and the sea as an opportunity, not as a roadblock, that the way people in town think of it as well. It's the edge of the world. And we often tend to think of the Maya thought it as the underworld and the edge of the world. But it was, if you knew the sea, and these coastal people knew the sea, then they didn't have difficulty. And they controlled the trade because they had the ability to navigate in whatever waters they want. And the rainy season is not a time to pull up your canoe. The rainy season, you can go along the shoreline, you can go up rivers. It's, you can travel in the water year round. And, but in terms of food, on the Keys, we found a lot of tree crops, cahoon, coyol, mamey, avocado, and others. And we found, except we haven't found avocado in the lagoon system, but we found a lot of cahoon nuts and a lot of coyol and mamey, which don't grow in a mangrove swamp, but do grow nearby. There's high ground, cahoon ridge nearby. So, they were clearly in communication with nearby coastal sites. In fact, I've suggested maybe they lived at nearby Wild Cane Key. Is sort of self-serving because I excavated at Wild Cane Key, but it's very close, and it's a 10-acre village site that's contemporary. So they certainly had food to eat there, but I think they were probably bringing in corn, or they had somebody was growing field crops nearby. But they were salt makers, like Sacapulas.
Thank you.
Yeah, Liz.
Thanks, Heather. That talk was absolutely fascinating, and I have a lot of questions for you, but I'll sort of limit it down to a few. I was wondering if you could talk more about the chert tools and where they're coming from. Is this northern Belize chert that's coming in, or something closer, Belize River Valley perhaps? Any idea where chert tools are coming from and how much they're being sort of modified on site versus sort of imported wholesale, let's say?
Are you going to the AAA conference?
I'm not, no, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah. I have a doctoral student, Holly Lincoln, who is doing her dissertation. dissertation on chert tools from the lagoon and from other sites. And since we haven't been able to go to Belize, she's made some headway. But I've suggested, and she agrees, and in fact, Tom Hester agreed that it's coal hot chert largely that we have. And I know I took some chert to Austin a number of years ago, and if even though it doesn't look on the surface like coal hot chert because it's all discolored black or gray from the matrix, underwater matrix, if you break it open, which I told Holly she can't do, but I did with some flakes from Wild Kinky, you break it open and it's a light brown color. It looks, some of it is that streak, it's chert with streaks through it, so you can see it looks like some kinds of coal hot chert. There's not a lot of we haven't found chert sources, but certainly that's something that Holly's going to look into with a local geologist, hopefully, who's been working with the project. But it's, I mean, it really opens a lot of doors. It's like they're getting chert from northern Belize. Well, I said to Holly the other day, there's at Copan, there's an Altunha vessel. We think of the Altunha vessel from Copan. People were moving great distances with things if they wanted them. And we're getting, Belize red, wherever it's from, and lots of other things at the lagoon. So yeah, as far as we know, but she's going to do some thin sectioning and look through the PXRF, and she's done some technical analysis as well. Wait for her dissertation or publication. I'll give you her email.
That would be lovely. Thank you. That's fascinating. I was going to say the stemmed macro blades look awfully Kolha-like.
Yeah, yeah.
I was also going to ask you about those round tools that look like scrapers. Am I correct? They're scrapers, the round ones that you showed that had sort of a hemispherical sort of cross section.
Yeah, there's a couple of kind of roundish things in photographs. Some of them are just we call them chopper pounders. They're round spherical things, and they've got lots of wear around the edges. But there are some things that are scraping tools that are that have a flat surface and have edges. They don't seem to be a formal tool per se. They may be reworked from something else, but they're utilized.
How thick are they? Just out of curiosity.
How thick are they? Oh, not very thick. They're not like thin scrapers, but they're maybe an inch thick. We've scanned them and we've scanned them and have we have 3D printed models. I should send you one.
That would be lovely.
You'd probably like a 3D, a plastic print.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, if you found those in Highland Chiapas, I would say they're maguey scrapers. But I wouldn't imagine that maguey would grow that in that environment, but maybe something similar that requires a similar motion. I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting.
Because we have in Highland Chiapas and also Gary Feynman and Deborah Nicholas have also found a number of what are sort of a intermediate Oaxaca Chiapas version of turtleback scrapers that tend to have that very rounded plan section and a very domed cross section, somewhere between an inch and a half. So
yeah, well, it's interesting because I have another master's student. Everybody's looking at collections because we're not going anywhere. But she's measuring the for another site, not at the lagoon sites, but measuring the diameter of perforations in potsherd discs in terms of what kind of spindle whorls they might have been, what kind of material they were they were using. Was it cotton? Was it agate? Was it, so we'd expect the thicker ones to be not cotton, but she's got to, we'll see what she finds.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much.
No more questions?
There's one in the chat.
Okay.
I can read out. Why did they not move inland and continue to make salt as the site was being inundated with water, or did they move elsewhere?
Oh, why did they, when the sea level rose? I think the question of what happened to the salt works, they're flooded now, but as far as we know, and we're working on this in terms of radiocarbon dating the mangrove peat and the wooden buildings and looking at see what the time sequence was, that the market for salt dried up, so to speak. At the end of the classic period, the sites in the interior of southern Belize were abandoned. The sites on the coast, like Wild Kankakee, continued, and some other sites on the coast continued and tied in with the emerging post-classic Circum-Yucatan trade. But the market for salt certainly slowed down and then ended. So I think the sites were abandoned, and people, question of where did people go when they didn't have any more work. Maybe they went to some of the other coastal sites nearby that were still, they moved, became fisher people instead of salt makers. We do find at Wild Kankakee and Frenchman's Key that in the post-classic, the salt production continued, but it was more like a household thing. People just, there's not much, but they were making salt because there's some salt making pottery, there's some briquetage, but not on the same level of intensity. It's like when you want to make a little bit of maple syrup, you might be foolish enough to make it indoors in your kitchen. It's a bad idea, but instead of a sugar shack. But so the people could have just gone to another coastal community. We don't really know.
So I have one more question. It might be a bit boring, and you may not know the answer because you haven't excavated at the site yet. But what do you think that gouge was being used for with the rubber handle? Because it looks like a functional artifact as opposed to, more of a ritual or prestige good.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that it was right beside both, the gouge and the handle were right beside a post, and in a building, sort of makes me again think back to the Seren site where things, Paynes and Cheese talks about things falling from the rafters, where tools have been placed up in high places and then just drop down. So I kind of tend to think of it that way, and that it was used for, that it was functional. As George Harlow said, it's a really durable material that would have been an excellent, really hard tool. So, what are the options? It's a really good question. And what are the options for what kind of materials could it have been used for? I really don't know. I mean, at first I thought salt, but maybe it could have been used for scraping out the inside of pots. But if they were making salt cakes, they'd just break the pots and discard the things. Cynthia Robbins has an article in Belizean Studies from Aventura, where they found a whole lot of tiny pieces of what appeared perhaps to be salt-making pottery just outside of the main plaza. And there was some tiny marine mollusks associated with them. And they hadn't excavated, but she published just their preliminary interpretations and suggested maybe they were bringing salt cakes in the containers and breaking them there, which makes sense and does happen. For example, there's salt making in the Philippines, traditional salt making, where hardened salt is traded in the pots, and they trade it to inland sites, people at inland sites, for rice. And so, then the pots are at the inland sites. So for us now, I think sort of looking at quantifying things to see what was found at our salt kitchens versus what might be missing from the salt kitchens will help us. And is there briquetage at inland sites nearby? I've sort of thought of them as mainly trading salt cakes, because why would you bother with the pots if you have a hard salt cake? But, oops. Sorry, I got cut out. Yes?
I have a follow-up question as well. You were talking about the fact that the calcium carbonate unfortunately doesn't survive. But it sounds like you did find maybe some shell middens. Was that maybe the structures of apatite that were left, or some other aspect of the shell? And if that's true, is that something that they were doing maybe as part of a complementary industry, kind of like the shell mounds on the Pacific coast in the Soconusco? I'm just curious to know more about that.
Yeah, at several sites we found deposits of mangrove oysters, mainly two different kinds of mangrove oysters, and which are right there. And all I know is, we have the skeletal structure of the shells. The shells are still there, although they're kind of holy. They've got lots of pit marks and holy, and there's nothing for oxygen isotope, but I don't know chemically. That's an interesting question. What actually remains, because there's something still that remains to hold up the structure of the shell. I think they were just eating shell, and that it doesn't take much. So in terms of, so they had, what were they eating? Were they bringing corn? Well, they certainly they could have been eating mangrove oysters. I've never tried them myself, but if I were living out there and there was lots of mangrove oysters, I might, because they're probably tasty. So I think they were just eating them. I don't know that it was a complementary industry. They seem to be on the edge of the underwater sites that we have them at half a dozen underwater sites that we've found, and all but one, they're pretty deep sites, but they all but one, they tend to be at the edge of sites as far as we can tell. So there's the salt making, and then off to, like, they're dumping stuff, they're throwing it away. But that was only the excavations that we did, that was using dive gear, and we only did really shovel tests. We did, well, with trowels into bags underwater. So we haven't done extensive excavations. The one shell midden at a shallow site that's right at the site is at the Eleanor Betty site, and it's a really shallow deposit. So I think it was, may have been at a slightly different time period over top of the site. I used to think of the sites as single component and pretty cool. Now I realize that they're multi-component and really complicated, which is okay.
I guess what I meant by complementary industries was the potential for shell currency production. But I also know mangrove swamp might not be conducive to the kinds of reef species like spondylus and olive shells that were typically used for currency. So I guess that was That was sort of what I was getting at.
Well, yes. Okay. Complementary industries. Yeah, I think the mangrove oysters from the lagoon sites more dietary, but wild Kankakee again is right there, and it has all sorts of what you would call reef species. Everything, you know, from Spondylus gigas to Turbinella angulata and lots and other little shells that were carved with little happy faces that you see. I've forgotten the name of those. And so lots, an abundance of shell that were used more than just for dietary uses. And I actually hadn't thought about them making things for currency, but you know, since I've been talking about currency and trade, that's certainly a viable opportunity to think of the shell that way. At Wild Kankakee, the classic period deposits are deeply buried by thick post-classic deposits, which is kind of unfortunate for looking at the classic period. And they're also really deeply buried below the water table, so hard to access and and covered with those annoying post-classic deposits.
I personally love the annoying post-classic deposits, so I'd be super curious to know more about that. But
yeah, we have some pretty cool post-classic deposits. I shouldn't say annoying, but they're annoying only if you want to get down to the classic period. But certainly, yeah, we have post-classic coral architecture using coral rock and finger coral as subfloor material, with earthen floors at Wild Kankakee and Frenchman's Key that we've excavated, and at another island site, dredging coral rocks and building huge platforms. So that's pretty cool, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It's pretty cool.
There's a lot to love.
We don't have any more questions on Facebook, so I just wanted to extend my thanks for an excellent talk and for an interesting discussion period. And I think we're about to wrap up, but if you want to stay on for a minute or two afterwards, you're more than welcome to.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for the opportunity to talk here and for your insightful questions. And so people have been signing off, and I appreciate people coming to hear a talk. So thanks.